That other story was kind of boring to me, so I skipped it. Let's see what the second one. Let's see what the second one talking about. I hope it's better.
On the evening of Sunday, January 26th, 1851, a 23-year-old man named 𝗢𝗧𝗛𝗡𝗥 hurried up the walkway of a home in Fall River, Massachusetts. It was so cold that 𝗢𝗧𝗛 could see his breath, but despite the weather, he could not stop smiling. And that was because he was about to do something that he loved to do that made him a lot of money, and it was actually the third time that day that he was even doing it. I mean, this was
about
awesome.
to do?
𝗢𝗧𝗛 was a psychic medium, and he was about to perform a seance. So at this point in America, in 1851, there was this phenomenon going on called the spiritualist movement. Basically, huge numbers of people began to believe that the living and the dead could actually communicate with each other through mediums like 𝗢𝗧𝗛. And at this time, there was a very specific way that mediums like 𝗢𝗧𝗛 conducted their seances. They would sit at a round table along with all their guests that were going to participate, and they would summon spirits. And what would happen is the participants in these seances could literally tell when it was that the spirit actually made contact with the medium. Because the round table they were all sitting at would shake or move, sometimes the table would thump so violently that one of the legs of the table would break off. And a broken table at a seance was considered a huge success.
I might be crazy for saying this, but can they not fake this? Like I know there had to be some people finessing with this, getting money.
So seances were a craze all over the country, and many people did genuinely believe that, people like 𝗢𝗧𝗛, mediums, could talk to ghosts in these seances. But there were lots of people also who didn't believe any of it, thought it was completely made up, but they would still hire people like 𝗢𝗧𝗛 to have these seances at parties and other functions as sort of a form of entertainment, kind of like how you might hire a band or a magician. And in Fall River, Massachusetts, there really was a big appetite for these seances, both, because people believed they were true and lots of people who thought they were fake. And it's in part because there were lots of homes in Fall River, Massachusetts at the time that sort of had some history about being haunted, and so there was sort of groundwork laid for both believers and non-believers to contract people like 𝗢𝗧𝗛. Now, to be clear, 𝗢𝗧𝗛's whole seance act was a blatant fake. In fact, many of the people who hired 𝗢𝗧𝗛 knew in advance that it was all an act, that 𝗢𝗧𝗛 really was more of a performer than a psychic medium. But 𝗢𝗧𝗛 was really good at faking it, and so he had become kind of like the go-to medium, certainly in Fall River, which meant for him to maintain this flow of business, he really had to put full energy into every performance to keep getting people to call on him. So on this day, as 𝗢𝗧𝗛 is sitting there getting ready to start his third seance of the day, he was tired. I mean, it's pretty exhausting to do these performances.
I bet it
is.
But
he knew he just had to get that second wind and just push through and do as good of a job as he possibly could. And so as the homeowner of this third seance opened up the door and let him inside, 𝗢𝗧𝗛 was sure this was going to be at least as good, if not better, than the other performances of the day. Moments later, the homeowner, John Gardner, led 𝗢𝗧𝗛 into the living room where several other guests were already gathered. 𝗢𝗧𝗛 immediately snapped
I want to see what's about to happen.
He swooshed his cape as he walked in, and he waved his hand around the room to command their attention. And when everyone turned to look at him, he said, "I have broken 2 tables today, and now I've come to break yours." The guests all cheered and clapped, and 𝗢𝗧𝗛 could tell they were going to be a very enthusiastic audience, which always made these seances much more fun. So into the parlor they all went.
I ain't gonna lie, that sounds pretty fun though.
Around this big circular table in the middle of the room. And then 𝗢𝗧𝗛 dimmed the lights and walked around the table giving his instructions. He then told them to all hover their hands over the table with their palms down and their fingers spread, and that each of them would have to touch the hands of the person sitting next to them. He told them that once they were all touching, it would create a circuit that was more inviting to the spirits. And so once all of his guests got into position with their hands, 𝗢𝗧𝗛 took his seat and did the same thing with his own hands, creating a full circuit all the way around the table. And at that point, everybody was ready. And so he nodded, and in a commanding voice, he said that now he was going to speak to the spirits. And if the spirits in the room felt like answering, they would move this table. The room got deadly quiet as everyone waited to see what 𝗢𝗧𝗛 would do. But 𝗢𝗧𝗛 just let the tension grow, because he knew that the longer he waited, the more anticipation would build. This was actually Bailey's favorite part of the performance, and he could feel his own heart begin to race. I mean, this really was exciting. But then finally, he broke the silence and called out to the spirits in the room and demanded that if there were a ghost here, to make itself known. And at this, everyone immediately began to look around excitedly, which created the quick distraction that Bailey's actually needed to perform his first trick. So mediums used a few different tools to help them fake communication from these ghosts, and one of those tools were these special hooks that they actually attached to their wrists, and they hid them under their sleeves. And then when they put their hands palm down, hovering over the table like they told everybody else to do, those hooks would actually go below the table and grip on, so the medium could, without looking like they're actually touching the table, literally lift the table up and rattle it around, again, without appearing to actually touch it. Now, it actually took a lot of strength to do this. I mean, imagine moving a huge table around just like with your arms kind of hovering over the table.
Facts, especially with a lot of people.
Really good at it. And so as his guests were all looking around, looking out for ghosts, Bailey's masterfully hooked his hooks right under the table and began moving his wrists around, which caused the table to thump. And as soon as this happened, a woman on the other side of the table screamed, and the other guests began laughing and getting really excited. But Bailey's was only just getting started. He called out to the spirit again,
If
much
you know
more
it's
forcefully
fake, how
this
do you get
time.
scared?
And as he did, he literally made the table rise off the floor as all the guests gasped. One man asked how Bailey's was even doing this. I mean, he knew this was fake, but how are you lifting the table up? Because his hands are over the table, remember. It's just these secret hooks underneath. But Bailey's just kind of ignored the man and smiled. And then he said to the spirit that if you're willing to communicate with us, rap on this table one time. And then Bailey's used the hook, underneath the table to make a knocking sound. And as he did this, the woman who had first screamed on the other side of the table, she jumped. She was so scared. And it actually caused Bailey's to have this surge of adrenaline.
I ain't gonna lie, that's like
He
a
was
real
really
talent.
doing a good job. And so Bailey's actually kind of leaned into this and rattled the table a bit more for dramatic effect. And in doing this, Bailey's was really exerting himself. He's trying not to give off the vibe that he's moving this table around, but he really is. And so he's sweating bullets, and he's also yelling out to the spirit, demanding them to come forward and talk to us. But then, as Bailey's is doing this big act here that he in no way suspects is going to actually call spirits into the room, he suddenly felt the room turn icy cold. And he had this weird tingling sensation flowing through him. He blinked, and then his vision got hazy. This had never happened to him during any of his seances.
Whoa.
And clearly, it was having an effect on him because he no longer
boy
was trying to
getting
communicate
possessed.
with the dead. He was just kind of standing there, very uneasy, like this seance was actually doing something, that there really might be spirits in the room. Now, Bailey's can tell he's getting stared at, and he doesn't want to destroy his business here. He needs to maintain the act. He can't just spook himself out and stop the seance. But at the same time, he couldn't break out of this weird feeling he had. The room felt so cold. Something was off here. And then he tried to move, and it was like he couldn't. He was frozen. Now, at the same time Bailey's is experiencing this, across the table, the homeowner and host, John Gardner, is just sitting there staring at Bailey's, trying to figure out what's actually happening here. And from his perspective, he watched as Bailey's went from sort of standing there awkwardly, unable to move, it looked like, to then sitting down in his chair and sort of lurching back in this awkward position. And then Bailey's eyes began darting all over the room, and also his breathing got really ragged and heavy. And John couldn't help but feel like it looks like Bailey's is possessed for real. And then Bailey's began to speak, and his voice sort of cracked as he did, and he began mumbling something that John and the others couldn't understand. John, he really couldn't help it. He felt sort of spooked by this. This was really convincing. John actually wanted to applaud. Bailey's acting was
I would
so
be
good
spooked
here.
too, is
But
it
he also
good,
didn't want
Mark?
to destroy the act and sort of break his character. Like Bailey's, John and most of his guests did not believe seances were real at all. But, Bailey's performance was really turning out to be way better than any of them had expected. But just then, Bailey's shot up out of his chair, and the whole table thumped again and shook, and then Bailey's let out this almost ghostly-sounding moan, and then one of John's guests asked if the ghost was speaking through Bailey's. But instead of answering, Bailey's eyes rolled all the way back in his head, so only the whites were visible. John and the others were transfixed. This was just incredible, really
Yeah, it's
kind of
time to end
scary
the
stuff
seance
here.
and get out the
But then
room.
Bailey's let out another moan and then fell backwards hard onto the ground. And for a second,
think
there was
bro
just
need an
confused
exorcism now.
silence. Because if this is an act, That was a violent fall. This looks really legitimate. How is Bailey's able to do this over and over again? This seems real. And it was in that moment of realizing that something is off here that some of the guests began to scream and they began to run out of the room. A few minutes later, a local physician named Dr. Hopper ran into the parlor of John Gardner's home. He'd been summoned by one of the guests who had panicked and actually ran out and gotten him. But that guest had been rambling about a ghost and a possession, so Dr. Hopper really wasn't sure what kind of problem he was actually responding to. But now he could see there was a group of people dressed for a party gathered around what appeared to be a seance table, pointing to the floor, where there was this young man lying in a crumpled heap. Dr. Harper went to the young man and reached out and felt the man's neck, but there was no pulse. And so the doctor turned and looked at the group and said, "He's dead." And before the group could really even react, the doctor said, "Now hold on.
Ain't no way, bro.
Someone needs to slowly and clearly explain what happened here." John Gardner stepped forward, and now
So you telling me bro just died from getting possessed from the seance? Oh, nah, bro.
very shaking voice, explained that this young man was a medium whose name was Bailey Staples, and he had been doing a seance, and he had demanded a ghost talk to the group. And then a moment later, he was thrashing around, apparently possessed by this ghost, and then he fell to the ground, dead. John said they had all thought this seance was a fake. I mean, when they hired Bailey's, they literally thought this was just going to be a performance, nothing real. But now, I mean, they didn't know what to think. This looked very real. Dr. Hopper shook his head, not really sure what to make of this explanation. He certainly did not believe in ghosts, but after a quick examination of Bailey's, he really couldn't see any obvious cause for the medium's death. So Dr. Hopper got to his feet and told the dinner guests that, whatever killed Bailey Staples was not a ghost, but he didn't know what it was yet. However, he would get to the bottom of it. However, by the next morning, news of Bailey's death had spread all over Fall River and beyond, and it made the immediate autopsy that Dr. Hopper wanted to do to figure out what happened to him basically impossible. Now, the reason it was impossible is because some people were claiming that this was a ghost that possessed Bailey's, but it didn't actually kill him. The ghost must have put Bailey's into a trance where he appears dead, but is not actually dead. But if Dr. Hopper performs the autopsy on him, the autopsy will kill Bailey's, so you can't do that. And so pretty quickly, you have all these people that are showing up at Dr. Hopper's clinic and the local police station demanding authorities give them Bailey's body to prevent the doctor from killing him by doing an autopsy on him. And so it's this whole scene. And at the same time, keep in mind, the country as a whole has been taken with seances. That was already something that was sort of happening everywhere. But this story, which sort of legitimized the idea that ghosts could be real and ghosts can also be dangerous given what happened to Bailey's, this story is spreading like wildfire all over the country. And so at a time where people in America were already big on seances, this pretty much dumped gasoline on that, and seances became even more popular, but now because they felt real, not because they were entertainment. On January 28th, so 2 days after Bailey's was pronounced dead, Dr. Hopper stood in the basement of the local morgue holding a scalpel. He had finally gotten the approval to go ahead and conduct his autopsy, but he knew that a lot of people were not happy about it. And now he was looking down at Bailey's body, realizing that, to his own surprise, he was sort of nervous about this. Like the idea that, what if this guy's actually still alive and I'm about to kill him with this autopsy? Now, logically, the doctor did not think Bailey's was in a trance, but it was unsettling how physically healthy Bailey's body looked. He was young and strong with no history of illness, and there wasn't a mark on his body anywhere to explain why he was dead. The only blemishes on his skin were these slight bruises around his wrists, which Dr. Hopper understood were from the special hooks he had been wearing when he died to lift up the table. But Dr. Hopper shook off the nerves and moved his scalpel towards the skin of Bailey's chest and made his first incision, opening up the chest cavity. And that was when Dr. Hopper saw it. It would turn out, on the day Bailey Staples died, he was at his absolute performative peak as he lifted John Gardner's table up off the ground and made the seance guests scream and laugh.
That makes sense.
But what Bailey's didn't know, and what Dr. Hopper found when he performed the autopsy, was that Bailey's had a pre-existing heart condition, and his passionate performance, coupled with the physical exertion it took to lift up that heavy parlor table with just his wrists, and the fact that Bailey's had also already given 2 other similar performances that day, caused his weak heart to swell and develop an aneurysm which ruptured and caused fatal internal bleeding. Bailey Staples had basically put on the absolute best seance performance of his life. It was so good, in fact, that it killed him. And also accidentally
At least he died
convinced
doing
an
what he
entire
loved,
house
man.
full of dinner guests and many people all across the country that ghosts were real.